All right, what's up, you geeks? Welcome back. It is that time of the month again. And this time, y'all, we are having Christmas in July, and nobody's safe because I've got the wheel this time.
Oof.
Thank you all for joining us on this beautiful Friday afternoon, evening. I am one of your hosts. I am Joe Day. And of course, as always, I am joined with the co host with the most. What's up, Christian?
Not much, Joe. I'm ready. Someone else is having to do the work for this one, so I can sit back and just commentate.
Yeah, so what I want you guys to do in the audience is take a drink every single time that I mess up a name going forward because, that's going to be fun. So it is
I cannot
Christmas.
condone that action.
He's like, he speaks for himself. He speaks for himself. This is what happens when you give me the steering wheel. So we are so Christmas, right? It is that magical time of the year, and I was given the ability to pick my topic, and I had a conversation with my wife, and there was only one clear and present choice, and that is the Icelandic murder floof itself. We are talking about the Yule cat. Crackling log fires, freshly fallen snow, twinkling lights, and a murderous monster cat out on the loose. Krampus is not the only Christmas entity around. Don't be fooled. While the murder cat may be fluffy, unlike why? Okay, hopefully you
Oh,
guys hopefully I'm here. I'm going to go forward as if I'm still here, but I got okay, cool. I got a notification on my side. Anyway, so we're talking about the Yule cat comes from the Icelandic word for Yule and katush. So Yule cat. Um so this creeping cat goes through the streets looking for its prey. Anyone who has not received new clothes by Christmas. But Iceland has no wild, large, predatory cat
mhm.
species. So, why does this creature take on a feline appearance? And why do these murderous little things only attack people with old clothes? We have to take a look at Icelandic, easy for me to say, mythology and the importance of oral storytelling and wool production. But before we get there, I have a very important question for you, Christian. Is
Mhm.
this the first time that you've ever heard of Yule cats? And if not, how long have these things been haunting your nightmares?
No, this is not the first time I've heard of it. In fact, I had read a book on folklore like maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and it mentioned like the Yule cat and Grilla and her kids and everything involved, and like the Icelandic folktale of Christmas. And I'm like, well, I'm glad I didn't grow up in Iceland where I was worried about what these people would do breaking into my house and murdering me if I just happened to be poor and didn't have new clothes or anything. This is the most capitalistic nightmare monster possible.
It's true. It's true. It's like if somebody manifested a cryptid based around economy and capitalism, you've got a Yule cat. It's fascinating. Um, so we've got the picture of glowing eyes, sharp whiskers, and this gigantic cat that towers over houses that as it prowls the snowy streets. It hunts people rather than mice, and its favorite prey is children. It's this giant feline that lurks among the countrysides, checking in windows to see which children have received new clothes for Christmas. And if the Yule cat spots anyone with frayed or torn clothing, he eats them. And perhaps the most famous account of the Yule Cat, and the one that most modern Icelanders are familiar with, comes from a poem that we're going to be covering later on in our show. Before we get into the origins, I was introduced to, really, I could say this for most all cryptids, other than like local legends from where I'm from. But my wife is hardcore into cryptids. And she did, when she was hosting her podcast, doing like scary stories, stuff like that, she did her first Christmas special was like framed as if it was going to be Krampus, but instead of being Krampus, it was Yule Cat,
Mhm.
because she's like a huge fan. And so that was my first introduction. And so there's so many of them that I feel like are so popular when you start talking about cryptids and all of that, that this is one of them that not nearly as many people have a familiarity, namely because, again, it lives in the shadow of things like Krampus or the Yeti, snow monsters, stuff like that.
Yeah, and with
So,
things like Krampus, that's more of a recent thing too. It's like, yeah,
yeah,
outside of Germany and Bavaria and that region, you didn't really see it until, I mean, the movie came out, was it 2015? And like I remember in college hearing it. So that would have been like 2011, 2012 for the first
yeah,
time. So yeah, it's no wonder the Yule Cat didn't make its way here before Krampus. It's one of them is a bit more attractive as a monster, like terrorizing people.
yeah. Yeah, it's I would imagine that unless you completely rework the standardized model of the Yule Cat, you can't really get away with it in the same context that you could with something like Krampus. And that's really something fascinating, right? Because there's this comfortability that we find in the morose, or the very clearly dangerous, or the very clearly monstrous forms that center around cryptids, right? That's you look at any one of them, and some of the most standard boilerplate ones are absolute monstrosities. And then you have this depiction of just an oversized cat. And yes, an oversized cat that eats children, but it's not talked about in the context where it's, other than its size, it's not a classical monster. And I don't know about you, but there's almost something off-putting about that fact, that
Yeah.
like it's not standardly scary, and thus it's scarier, you know?
Yeah, it's one of those when you actually think about what this creature is capable of, what the lore behind it is. It's like, well, some Icelandic peasant out there is living in fear of not only this, but this is just a familiar, essentially, of Grilla and who mother of the Yule lads who will come into your house, break things up. You don't have like spoons and very, very specific things. If you don't have them,
Yeah,
then you're in trouble. And so, like growing up as a kid, I'd be like, are all my eggs in the basket here? Do we have everything ready, or are we going to get visited by the Yule lads and the Yule cat? Like, no, please, just take this fear away from me. I just
right.
want to celebrate Christmas, please.
I just want the jolly fat guy in the red suit back, come on. And so meanwhile, everybody that's like everybody that has a cat, and for the record, I have three. um Here's a story about a giant oversized cat that is just running around wreaking havoc, and you're like, yep, checks out. Yep, I'm in. You got
Yep,
me. Like, I'm into it, you know.
that-
Um
no lies
so
detected here.
exactly. So we get into the origins, and the first definitive message mention of the Yule Cat comes from an 1862 collection of folklore that
Drinks at the ready,
hasn't.
people.
Say again.
Said drinks at the ready, people.
Yeah, I'm saying, by John Armisen. I'm going to give you guys some of them because other ones I'm not even touching. So look up that name, look up Yule Cat, you'll find it. Anyway, it
Coward.
was just yes. Um, but it was described. I have far too many German fans on my other podcast for me to not be a coward here. Anyway, um, so it's described as this evil beast that would either eat those that did not get new clothes for Christmas or eat their Christmas bit, an extra portion of food given to residents of the farm. And so John gave no source for either story. But again, this is I think some of the beauty of when you're looking at folklore and the use of beastly images to convey the point, because it's another Christmas tale of leave a portion for whatever this entity is, or else you're gonna get eaten by a giant cat.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that that the popular concept of this time of this period of time is centered around gift giving, but you have this area that largely their gifts and their goods were scarce, and so it would be some small piece of clothing. And so right from the get you can see just how many things are getting poured into this particular tale.
Yeah.
So um so two theories that have been proposed for the origin of the story. In one theory, folklorist Arnie Bjornson, feel confident about that one, points to a footnote by John, which uses the figure of speech to dress the cat. From the footnote and the lack of any written sources about the Yule Cat prior to John's writing, Arnie concluded that the phrase was the source from which John created the monster. In another theory, archaeologists.
Time.
Yeah, yeah.
What the hell does dress the cat mean?
You're gonna have to go back in time and ask them, because yeah, I it's not. So I tried to look it up and I couldn't find anything definitive from that
Okay.
portion of time. I found like later, like mid 1900s, there were some things that meant like getting a kid ready or something along those lines, but I couldn't find anything clearly connected to this time frame enough to be able to say definitively.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, so that's one of my favorite parts about this is we have our American versions of cryptids where, if you geeks listened a couple months back to our episode on Mothman, right? We did an episode on Mothman. Could it exist? Is it real? Is it this? Is it that? What I think is more intriguing about this style of of cryptid is it's so clearly folklore and born out of that place, that it tells you about the society. It tells you about how people use storytelling to convey their own emotions about something in particular.
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna ask you later on, might as well right now. Like, this is not what I would typically think of as a cryptid. I would put this more in like the paranormal, if anything, for a folklore kind of setting. So I was curious to see like your justification for putting it under the cryptid category. So that's very interesting. I like that.
So, as far as the classification goes, in around 2008, there was an article about the Yule Cat, was it's pretty pretty well regarded as at least one of the origin points for the modern popularity of the Yule Cat. And because the focus isn't so much on this is something that could happen, like a spiritual entity of some kind, a haunting, a creeping entity that could, it's not ever framed like that in a modern context. It's framed more like a Bigfoot, like a, you know, Loch Ness, where it's there you have your people that can, you know, make something out of nothing as far as a legend goes and stuff like that. And suddenly there's a whole group of people who are super into Bigfoot that would like a word with me, and I am not taking any questions at this moment in time. uh, but you have it's presented more like that. And so because of that, and because of the way that this is such a stand in, and generally cryptids all have that category of um clearly not real, it's lent more in that direction than being like a paranormal entity.
Okay. I disagree completely. Cryptids are things that we think could possibly exist in the world, and it's scientifically attempting to verify them. So I would not categorize this as a cryptid, but you're also the one that chose it, so you can do whatever you want.
So yeah, I think that there are classifications of cryptids, and I would say that there are cryptids that are absolutely potentially, you know, hairless gorillas that are just walking out that we haven't identified yet. And then there's other ones that yeah, I mean, we tell our kids at night to tell them fantasy stories. um, and this is what it's like to poke at your co-host. Uh,
Uh-huh.
yep. So, so from here, we get into this whole idea of Christmas is coming, right? So Yule Cat traditionally used as an incentive or a threat to farm workers to finish processing Yule collected in autumn before Christmas. Those that took part in the work were rewarded with new clothes, but those who would not would get nothing and thus would be prey for the Yule Cat. And
Mm.
so, in establishment of the Yule Cat as a part of classic Icelandic Christian folklore came 1932 when Johannes Urkothin published his poetry collection that is translated into Christmas is Coming. One of the poems is centered around this man eating monster, which subsequently became a common part of Christmas festivities and decorations in Iceland. And so this is the part where, because of the nature of the story, this is why I would classify it as cryptids. And so jokes aside, and I knew going into this that my lovely co-host would have a bone to pick about my classification here. But for me, and this is the beauty of covering stuff like this, is we get to explore the depths of the unusual by talking about this. We get to explore how somebody processes things by way of these um entities or creatures, or these mysterious things that we talk about every month and all of that. And with something like the Yule Cat, it so marries the world of creeping, menacing creature that really feels like you should be afraid of this thing, and this mysterious entity that obviously has to be supernatural in in nature. And so for me, the beast side of it, that side of the characterization of it won out the day. And that's why I slid it into this, because of that style of what the story centers around. And it doesn't have some of the more classical beats, in my opinion, of what you would consider paranormal in nature. I see how somebody puts it in that category, but for me, I think I have such a different perspective on cryptids that I open the door for. There are cryptids that you look at that say, okay, we know so little about what else inhabits this world, that something that is bipedal, something that is hairless, yes, Bigfoot is the easiest one to point to over and over again, but something that we've never classified, and all of that, that is just a subspecies of primate, makes all of the sense in the world to me, that that is a possibility. I think you're going to have to find other evidence than what's been posited, but I digress. Whereas I think there are some other I love being a troll on the show. Anyway, um and so
That's why we get along.
yeah, and meanwhile you have these other ones that are more unexplainable, right? You would think that given a giant monstrous sea creature, that more people would have run into this thing, or more people would have run into Mothman or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yes. I have one final question before we need to move on. What's it like being the Joshua of this show?
Yeah, yeah, that's a come to Jesus moment that I needed to have, that I realized that I am 1000% the Josh of this stream. So,
Excellent.
just wait until but I will not be taking any editor's notes going forward. Like, 2 people got that joke, and that's okay.
Those are the
So
best jokes.
those are the best jokes. Um, so one of the poems, like I said, centers around this man-eating monster. And so what do we do with man-eating monsters? We put them on decorations, because that's logical. Um,
Yep.
so while the poem itself didn't associate this creature with Grayla or with the Yule lads, the characters were also featured in the collection, which gave this association between the different creatures, like Christian brought up before, and the commonality led to connections in later stories. And by the middle of the 20th century, this creature was considered the pet of Grayla and her sons. In some later stories, it's so disobedient that Surtur, Sturfer,
Mhm.
the smallest Yule lad, in is able to direct it, and he actually rides the cat across the countryside. I immediately knew that I needed to correct myself, because I knew that you were going to have a word with me if I mean, there's
There's a
part
bit
of
of
me
a
that
difference
wanted to be
between the
like,
two names.
I just, sometimes you just got to make sure that everybody's paying attention.
One's a giant, fire giant. The other is the one who's responsible for swiping your pans and eating any crust you leave behind.
Yeah, I mean, you say tomato, I say giant fire demon. It's really basically the same thing.
One and the
But
same, really.
to anybody who is more creatively sound out of the geeks that are watching, what I need for one of you to do is draw Surtur riding a cat. That needs to happen, and that needs to get put somewhere as a t-shirt idea, because absolutely.
Yeah. For those watching, this is a picture of your gal, Grilla, however the heck you want to say her name. She's not here to defend herself. So there's more bloodier pictures I could have chosen. So I decided, not that we're monetized or anything, But for the sake of that, that's what we're going to see.
Yeah, yeah, and it's such a natural story extension while being incredibly horrific out of another part of the world. Like, folklore from this part of the world goes hard, y'all. It just
Uh-huh.
does. And like, it's very standard in Norse, Icelandic, like that part of the world, for children to be in peril as a standard storytelling device for whatever they're trying to get across. So a lot of the folklore immediately um puts children in peril. And it's interesting to me, when you look at the different adaptations, I was curious to see, as you were gathering resources for today's stream, if you were going to go more of the, oh, they're tricksters and they just steal your stuff and all of that, or are we doing, Grayla eating a baby, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's one of those. As time goes on, as we have it with Grimm's fairy tales and like Disney and stuff like that. It gets softened as the generations go on. Grilla and the Yuletide lads, or whatever the heck their names are, they kind
Yeah,
of get softened. So I guess they don't want to scare the kids as much anymore. Maybe
yeah,
parents complained or something. I don't know. They had a big Icelandic council to decide it's time to change things. I would assume it's small enough to where they could get everyone there. It's a very lovely country. I'd definitely go back there in a heartbeat.
yeah. Yeah, and you talk about friendly people that are just, once you are a part of the community, by and large, in that part of the world, you are absolutely taken in. I love that part of the world. But
Yeah. I had
that
a hard time leaving Reykjavik.
yeah, yeah. So one of the things that I find interesting about this one in particular, before we move on, especially given the picture that you chose, is we are talking about a part of the world where Yule has a different connotation. And this enters into a larger conversation that I'm just going to say, for those of you that are more a part of the classical audience for systematic ecology, I will just say that in order to put these pieces together and not go down a rabbit hole of Christmas is evil, then all I'm going to say is we got to learn how to read world history and folklore history, because understanding both of those allows you to understand how different civilizations tell their stories and how they convey their message. And that's what I think is part of what makes this so interesting, is it almost gets back to some of those roots of this being more of a pagan celebration of the changing of the seasons, and more of that look into people are more insulated in the wintertime, and these are the needs that the society has, and that being more of the driving force behind the original version of this. Whereas it's more cutesy to think of demented little elves that are just pulling pranks and a giant oversized cat.
Yeah, it's one of those things like the bridging between Yule and Christmas. The pagan festivals being introduced to the idea of when is the birth of Jesus? Who knows? It was probably in March or April, sometime like that, if we know it all, which we don't. And you get the idea like this is at a time of the year in a country that's already extremely cold, where things
Yeah.
are really cold. So what do? Well, let's warm up and have fun. Let's
Yep.
go and celebrate. Let's have a feast. Let's go drink so that we can forget about the fact that we're living in the midst of a I almost said monsoon, goodness gracious, a snowstorm of immense proportions that just
Yeah.
doesn't end until eventually spring comes. And I say that as someone who loves the cold. Like, you got to have a festival like this so you bring people together, you have fun with one another, and you establish traditions and stuff like this. And then when Christians come into the picture, as we often do, some people just syncretize things together and they say, okay, we've got the celebration of Jesus, so let's just add that to what you already have on. And then eventually it became a little more about that than what it started as.
Yeah. And then you find afterwards when those threads of yarn have been tied together, it's a very easy way to see how, unfortunately, there are many folks who do not contain the capability to be able to know how to untie the threads. And
Yeah.
so we end up with, oh, the whole thing is evil because it has a connection somewhere where this word was tied in, and another group may have done something adjacent to what we're doing, and it's a whole mess. But this is also a time where we can see what a community valued in the way that they tell their stories, because the it's not hard to draw what the analogies are here. It's not hard to draw what the references are here when looking into why is this significant? Is this actually a thing? Are there people who actually think that this is real? And you raised a very good point. The further north that you go, and this is actually a weird intersection between the American North and Norse, where you hit the nail directly on the head, where you mentioned these killer snowstorms and these killer blizzards and all of that sort of thing, where there's something to that these winters are rough, they are intense, they are very real. And so that that fact is going to be reflected in the stories they tell, the myths they have, the cryptids they have, all of that.
Yeah. It's one of those. I mean, every culture in the world has something like this in a sense of, hey, bad things are going to happen. Well, how am I going to warn my children not to do it? Well, I'm going to tell them a story based around a fable. You know, you La Lloronas and be like, don't go near the water, otherwise La Llorona is going to get you, or something like that. Don't make sure you have good clothes for the winter. Make sure they're new clothes, because the better the clothes are, the more likely you're going to survive. And hey, watch out for your babies. There may be a giant ogre who comes in and murders your baby, or you got to make sure, oh, are the windows closed? Or is the baby warm? What's going on here? Like, as a parent, you needed to worry about something like that. So it's kind of like a cutesy, it's the wrong word to say, but like a reminder to do these things. Otherwise, bad things could happen.
Yep. Yep. So as we move forward, it bears mentioning that there are some interesting debates that have taken place over the last several years about the origins of the Yule cat. So folklorist Aki Carlson recently reflected
Don't you
on,
just get that middle name,
I don't know what you're
coward.
talking about. I see no middle name. Aki Goyani Carlson. There we go. Direct
That was your best
all
guess.
angry letters to Christian Ashley.
I'll take them. I'll send them to myself.
Yeah. So he recently reflected on the competing theories, highlighting three potential origins for the story. One theory is proposed by Arnie Bjornsson that suggests that the feline's origins might be a misinterpretation of the comic Icelandic term to dress the cat, like we talked about before. The other theory presented, like we said, is from archaeologist Guðmundur Olafsson,
Perfect.
that suggests that it could be one of the magical beasts that is accompanying Saint Nicholas, the Catholic saint of travelers and fishermen who later, along with Odin, became associated with Santa Claus. This theory parallels the potential origin of the Yule goat, Yule book, in Scandinavian Christmas folklore. So it was just a matter of time until the jolly fat dude in the red suit makes an appearance. So, and that is interesting that these characters sometimes will get looped in with each other because we do have a very legitimate belief that some hold about this Christmas entity that has the Christmas goats. And so the origin here is tied in with the Christmas goat. And if we had the ability of post production, I want you all to understand that I would be spamming the sound that the goats make from Thor Ragnarok. That is absolutely what I would be doing right now.
Don't you mean Love and Thunder?
Yeah, that one. They all blend together.
You
They
know-
both suck. Both of those movies are terrible.
Oh,
Anyway, oh wow. I
the
said the
latter one,
quiet part out loud. I said the
the
quiet
latter
part
part
out
I
loud.
agree with. Ragnarok's amazing compared to that.
I
Ragnarok
mean,
is like Citizen Kane compared to Love and Thunder.
when one bar is on the floor and the other one you just kind of need to step over, that's like saying I would rather drop a hammer on my foot than kick a couch. I'm just saying.
Continue.
And so, like we talked about before, in 2008, the English language online newspaper, the Reykjavik Grapevine, published an article about the Yule cat that has been considered partially responsible for the Yule cat gaining international recognition and the story of the Yule cat being repeated and expanded upon in a variety of other articles. In 2018, the city of Reykjavik set up a 5-meter tall iron sculpture of the Yule cat as a Christmas decoration in the city's central square.
How
And
much is that in freedom units?
in freedom units, I'm not dignifying that with a response. In in December of 2023, a film about the Yule cat titled Pjolkenist Veal, so localized into English as Krampus, was released in Iceland.
No, no, no,
So
no, no. Say it right. Say it right. Krampus,
Krampus. Yeah, there we go.
as in plus, as in Puss in Boots.
Yeah, as in Puss in Boots. Yeah, so I want to this is in my mind, this is the city planning meeting, right? So guys, I've got an idea. So track with me here, right? There's this story about this cat. Each children, I want to put up a mantle. This is the perfect decoration to have out a giant cat. Each children. It'll be great.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I tease my children all the time. I make them to the point where I think they're not going to get clothes for Christmas. And then right before the Yule cat comes, I gift them clothes. Very funny story. That was a terrible accent.
I just
1 out of 10.
I just want you all to understand that I, Joe, have nothing to do with that accent that you
Racist
just heard.
caricature.
Has nothing to do with me in any way, shape, or form. Uh, but I mean, and I you think about stories like this in the same way that you would think about something like the Tooth Fairy, right? In American folklore, where okay, so your teeth fall out, and then a little fairy flies around and takes your teeth and gives you money for them. That's not an innocent story. That's a horror show. Like that's not that's a little demon that's stealing teeth. Like, but that's what that's the life cycle of a piece of folklore like this, and the the story of this cryptid of Yule Cat, where it starts off as one thing, becomes um sterilized, becomes more innocent, and then kind of makes its way back to being horrific when somebody comes along and says, "Why is this sterile?" We're not talking about a giant domestic house cat. We're talking about a cat that's eating children.
Yeah, it's just commercializing things that could murder us. You know, they're not making
Yeah,
a brand for themselves, so we better make a buck off it ourselves.
exactly. Exactly. So, for the last piece of today's festivities, the oldest written sources of the Yule Cat come from the 19th century that refer to the fact that, again, those who do not get a new item of clothing for Yule are destined to become offerings for the Yule Cat. And while this might sound strange that the deprived ones will also become the sacrifices, but this tradition is based on the fact that every effort was made to finish all the work with autumn Yule before with autumn wool before Yule. The reward was though for those that took part in the work was a new piece of clothing, but the lazy received nothing. And a woman describes a scene from her youth in the last century thus: "We were lazy doing this chore. Then we were reminded of the Yule Cat. We thought that this was some terrible beast, and the last thing we wanted was to be one of his offers." One of Iceland's most beloved poets in this century, Johannes Colton, wrote a lay about the Yule Cat, and it follows in the translation of Vigner Johansson, who says, "You'll have to forgive me, but I didn't make it rhyme. I'm not much of a poet." And so here is the poem. You all know the Yule Cat, and that cat was huge indeed. People didn't know where he came from or where he went. He opened his glaring eyes wide, the two of them glowing bright. It took a really brave man to look straight into them. His whiskers sharp as bristles, his back arched up high, and the claws of his hairy paws were a terrible sight. He gave a wave of his strong tail. He jumped and he clawed and he hissed, sometimes up in the valley, sometimes down by the shore. He roamed at large, hungry and evil. In the freezing Yule snow, in every home, people shuddered at his name. If one heard a pitiful meow, something evil would happen soon. Everyone, everybody knew he hunted men, but didn't care for mice. He picked on the very poor that no new garments got. For Yule, who toiled and lived in dire need, from them he took in one fell swoop their whole Yule dinner, sometimes eating it himself, if he possibly could. Hence it was that the women at their spinning wheels sat spinning a colorful thread from a frock or a little sock, because you mustn't let the cat get a hold of the little children. They had to get something new to wear from the grown-ups each year. And when the lights came on Yule Eve and the cat peered in, the little children stood rosy and proud, all dressed up in their new clothes. Some had gotten an apron, and some had gotten shoes or something that was needed. That was all it took For all who got something new to wear stayed out of that cat's grasp. He then gave an awful hiss, but went on his way. Whether he still exists, I do not know, but his visit would be in vain if next time everyone got something new to wear. Now you might be thinking of helping where help is needed most. Perhaps you'll find some children that have nothing at all. Perhaps searching for those that live in a lightless world would give you a happy day and a merry, merry Yule.
Mm.
This, like a lot of our cryptid stories, your mileage may vary on where exactly somebody puts the pin on what is fact and what is fiction. Your mileage may vary on how serious somebody actually takes a story. And that's why I think the Yule Cat deserves to be included in cryptids. Not because I personally think that there's a giant oversized cat roaming the hills of Scandinavian countries, but because other people do, because other people look at this story and say this could happen. And that's really all it takes for a cryptid to be alive in somebody's mind. What do you think? Do you take this seriously?
I'll take the latter parts of that poem very seriously, especially not just at Christmas time, but all the time. Look out for those who are less fortunate, who aren't able to have the clothing they need to wear, the food they need to eat, the housing they need to just live. Like, look out for them. If this is the folk tale that gets you into that position of gifting something to the needy, of caring about your fellow man, of loving as Christ loved us, go for it. 100%. It just ain't a cryptid.
All right. So, with that, do you have anything else before I go ahead and wrap us up?
Yeah, I'm very happy with this one. This was a great one, Joe. Um, go out and visit Iceland if you can. I know it's money you have to spend, but if you got the extra cash just flowing, like
Yeah.
check out Iceland. So
Yeah.
yes, this was a good one. Do you want to introduce what we're doing next, or was that part of your wrap up you were going to do?
Yeah,
Okay,
we'll go into we'll cover that in the wrap up. Yeah, I
go
agree.
for it.
I would second your suggestion to head to Iceland to check out this part of the world because it is beautiful. It is it is absolutely something special. And so with that, that's all. That's it. That's a wrap for this one. Next week or next month,
Ooh, don't do that to
we
me.
we have another special episode for you all where again I will have the reins of the show, and in our rotation we are on the month of paranormal, and in having the control for for this series and getting a chance to talk about some of the topics that we really love and are special to us. For me, I have a special place in my heart for the story of the Perrin family. So, for those of you that are familiar with the movie Insidious, not Insidious, the movie The Conjuring, live, guys, live. The movie The Conjuring, essentially the same movie, just different actors. Uh, the it centers around the Perrin family, and next month we will be covering their story. We will be covering what actually happened and the accounts that one Andrea Perrin has who has covered in her series on the matter. So, with that, geeks, thank you all for joining us for another Friday night Frights. Stay spooky, y'all.
See ya.